This week, where's my camera? Oh, hi. Hey, this is Paul. This week, we've got a fantastic interview with a couple of folks that will be speaking at the InfoSecWorld conference coming up. Will Gragido, did I say that right?
Yeah,
Gragido. Yes, nice.
Will
Gragido and Mark Arnold will be here discussing the topic for their talk, which you're just going to have to stay tuned to find out all of the fun things they'll be talking about. I think we'll have a technical segment. At least we'll discuss a technical segment. It may be a meta-technical segment about testing for the MITRE ATT&CK framework using Caldera. Then in the security news, smart vibrators, more smart vibrators that can be hacked. Subway elevator movie plots. Bitcoin exchange was robbed, and not the way that you might think. CT and MRI machines are hacked, which is no big surprise there. Some interesting things happening in California, which Larry and I were talking about before the show. Let's see, and all kinds of other stories. So stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. I'm, of course, your host, Paul Asadorian. Excited to be here, as always, on Paul's Security Weekly.
Hi, and welcome to the show. I totally introduced our host right now, but I've got a totally awkward boner.
What? Where? Oh, hey! I'm in the studio with you guys. That's kind of cool.
Sounds like a plan.
And we'll at least have one person listening.
That's right. Just
Yeah, I know, and I appreciate it, and I'm glad you enjoyed your spooning with Jeff. But you know,
hey, that's actually built a new office.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, third baby on the way, so I needed a new office.
Nice.
I lost my old office. That's now the baby room.
Brought to you by
Signal Sciences is the industry's first web protection platform that works in any cloud, any container, any platform as a service, and any modern application architecture. The Signal Sciences web protection platform can be deployed in next-generation WAF, RASP, or reverse proxy modes, giving customers ultimate flexibility and coverage. Protect your web applications with Signal Sciences web protection platform. Signal Sciences, protecting applications, connecting teams. For more information, check them out at signalsciences.com/PSW. The average time between being hacked and realizing you've been hacked is 1 year. Can you afford to let an intruder roam your network for that long? Can your company weather the fallout when this comes to light? Black Hills Information Security can find the bad guys in your network and train you to do it yourself. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a hunt teaming engagement can help you find a persistent threat in your network. Welcome. Did Larry have an introduction? Hi, everyone. This is Paul Asadorian. I guess I'm introducing.
Apparently, I no longer do.
Okay.
Wow, and I look short.
Hey, it's Paul's Security Weekly. This is episode 546. I'm your host. Something funny from Larry, Paul Asadorian.
Dinosexual.
Dinosexual. You're dinosexual for this evening, Paul Asadorian. We've got a cast of characters here in studio and on the lines via Skype. I will start to my left. Mr. Matt Alderman is here with us, drinking a train of martinis. Apparently,
Yeah, they're all lined up in a single file line.
Come and drink a train. Oh, wait.
Oh, yeah.
Larry Pesce is, of course, here with us in
Whoa,
studio.
hey, I got taller.
He just got taller.
I did.
Michael, I think, got shorter since he's been here. Michael Santarcangelo is here in studio as well. It's nice to have everyone
It's
here.
still in a comfy chair, too. I love
Yes.
this chair. It's very comfortable.
Yeah, you get 2 days of me, so that's always fun.
Oh yes, oh yes. Everyone's been here for a while. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, especially after the Thanksgiving incident.
Yes. We don't talk about the Thanksgiving incident on air. Just
First rule of Thanksgiving incident. We don't
talk about it on air or in mixed company. People might get the wrong idea. And that's all we had to say about that. On the lines via Skype, Mr. Jeff Mann is here with us. Jeff, welcome.
Salute.
Hopefully you can stay on longer and better than you did for the meeting today. Hopefully we got all that out of the way earlier. Also,
I was on the whole time. You were the one that kept dropping.
Oh, it was it's us, not you. I get it. On the lines via Skype, Mr. John Strand is here. John, welcome.
Hey, how you guys doing? I am currently trying to put together a PowerPoint presentation because our Caldera server crashed and burned. And Joff is trying to rebuild the entire Caldera server as we speak. So if we're a little bit quiet, that's why. I think it's the gods getting back at me for like skipping out on Paul's meeting today. 'Cause, we got everyone together, and I totally ditched him. So God's got his finger on the smite button for me right now.
Yeah, but John, you and I can do that to each other, and it's all okay. It's just part of our awesome relationship that we have.
We show up in random places.
We just show up whenever we feel like it, and it's totally fine. It's totally fine.
But don't worry, I held down the fort for John.
I held down the fort.
Mr.
Joff Dyer is here with us. Joff, welcome on the lines via Skype as well.
Shh, he's reinstalling Caldera.
Oh, sorry to bother you. Sorry to bother you. We'll come back.
No. I am happy to report I just got my Caldera up.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
And if it stays up for more than 4 hours, you should consult a medical professional.
That's right. I should go consult a medical professional. No, you'll have to forgive John and I for looking rather ragged. We have had literally the week from hell. So we're definitely going to try and enjoy ourselves this evening as best we can. So, but it's good to be here.
I'd like to make a quick announcement before we introduce our special guest. Make sure you go to securityweekly.com/on-demand. John and I have actually done a webinar titled The State of Penetration Testing, as well as several other webinars that we do in collaboration with our sponsors, which are just awesome. You should go watch them. You can watch and register and watch them anytime at securityweekly.com/on-demand. So make sure you go do that. Alrighty. Our guests this evening are Will Gragido and Mark Arnold. Will is currently the Director of Advanced Threat Protection for Digital Guardian, and Mark Arnold is the Senior Director and CISO at Navisite. Welcome to the show.
Happening.
Thanks for having us.
Now, I'll start with Mark only because he's on the left, and I like to go from left to right.
And he's wearing a badass bow tie.
And he does have a bow tie on. So, Mark, give us a little bit about your background and maybe a little bit about how you got started in information security.
I guess basically, let me go back to early circa 2000, Y2K, kind of back into the industry at that time, trying to put out a fire that we all realized that when midnight struck that it was false. Served in a few IT roles and ended up somehow at Stake. So that's where I got my entrance into the industry. A lot of the Chris's at Vericode, now at Computer Associates, where my managers are Chris Hing, Chris Weisselpel Pond, and basically was on that team as a security analyst and also helping companies in certain consulting gigs around that time. Left there, tried to take those ideals into other industries. Spent time at TJX as an advanced threat manager there. A few other gigs in financial services. Decided that those ideals didn't quite work in those environments, and so went back to the consulting space and was at Opta for 2 years doing cloud security research. After that time ended there, found myself at Navisite, kind of doing something that I promised myself I would not do, and that was to go back into an IT-oriented role. I wanted to just be at a security company, but now I'm at a company where there are almost 900 security IT ecosystems that I have to provide security oversight for. So that's how we got to this point.
And Will, how about yourself?
I started in the 1990s, like a lot of guys, and been playing with computers and things as a youth. I was in the DoD and the Marine Corps, in an emerging MOS field that combined data security, intelligence, and a few other things. Got out the service, went into consulting. Worked for Arthur Andersen. Was my first paying gig, I guess you could say. Spent time in startups. Was with the old International Network Services. You probably remember those guys. INS. Was a member of the security practice there for a number of years, a principal. From there, went to ISS, the old Internet Security Systems. Worked there in a number of different capacities. Stayed after the IBM acquisition for a bit. Then steadily stayed within the product and vendor space, doing product research, research and development, threat research and intelligence work, SE work, evangelism, but predominantly product and research work. That led me through a series of twists and turns in the startup space of my own, the company called Cassandra Security, then onto Tipping Point within the DV Labs organization, then to NetWitness, where I co-founded, I should say, the first Watts research team at RSA, and then a series of startups again, and then finally, last but not least, Digital Guardian, here where I focus on advanced threat protection solutions for endpoint as well as network and cloud and some other good things. So it's been a really fun trip. Co-authored a few books, done a bit of speaking here and there, and happy to be here. And I don't have a bow tie, so I'm not as cool as Mark.
We all have goals. Looking as good as Mark is definitely one of mine. So how did you guys meet and then choose a topic for InfoSecWorld?
You want to go there, Will, or
you can go ahead? Yeah.
We've met each other time and time again, but just in passing at conferences. So I've been kind of nagging Will to come speak at Source Conference. So I'm one of the advisors for the current group of advisors at the Source Conferences, Boston, Seattle, now Austin, and now Mesa. And in trying to snag Will for the conferences, I caught him in the hallways at I think at the last Black Hat. And we were just talking about some random things in the industry, and that 5-minute meeting turned into a 4-hour conversation. Yeah. And so in fact, my wife now calls Will my boyfriend because we were texting left and right after that conversation. We talked about a whole slew of things about intelligence, where we saw intelligence going in terms of trends around intelligence in our communities, and the haves and have-nots. And we kind of thought, a conversation between someone who's a trained intelligence officer with someone who's working on the other side trying to procure either intelligence solutions to make companies more secure, and always coming up on the short end of the stick of doing that, and kind of came up with this idea of let's have a conversation from both sides of the coin, and see if we can hack intelligence in such a way that might give some folks insights and might help others who are struggling to bring intelligence into their security ecosystems. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's solid. I think the one clarifying element, I would say, I wasn't an officer, I was enlisted, but yeah, in that space. So, but yeah, tradecraft is really important. That was a really central concept to the conversation that Mark spoke about. Really, largely speaking, because intelligence is not, it's not a singular idiom, right? And going into the intelligence community and going into the Department of Defense, and then looking at that across the spans of the Five Eyes, and then looking at the historical origins of intelligence prior to it being absorbed into commercial security confines and contexts, really important. We noticed that over time, there's an awful lot of talk about intelligence analysis. There's an awful lot of talk about intelligence as being consumable and contextually relevant and actionable, but analysis, tradecraft is not often talked about, right? And it's really, at the end of the day, that's what separates us from success and failure, is how finely and how granularly and how acutely can we hone our analysis skills with the data that we have access to. How can we acknowledge our biases, remove our biases at the same time as we acknowledge those, not let them cloud our vision, and make the best determination of what we're working with at a given moment in time. And that was the gist of that conversation in a nutshell.
So what do you guys mean by put intelligence in context for us and for those listening?
For those of us that lack intelligence.
Yes,
I'll let
that too.
I'll let you start.
But I think it all began, in that particular moment, it was really, we began the conversation talking about all source intelligence, right? And then looking at, from let's say 100,000-foot view. I'm looking at the world in an all-source manner. I'm taking in diverse data sets, and I'm looking at sources without bias. largely speaking because I need to be cognizant of what's occurring from a signal-to-noise ratio prior to making any type of determination or allowing my own personal bias or my group bias influencing the decision as it relates to a specific data set, a source of data, or a collective element related to broader data sets. So first and foremost, contextually relevant intelligence is really intelligence that's related to a specific event of interest or series of events of interest prior to an event of interest ever being declared suspicious or malicious or an incident in security intelligence terminology or security operational terminology, right? Really understanding the diversity of intelligence data sets, the ecosystems that produce those data sets, the potential for those data sets to be manipulated and otherwise directed by adversarial entities and elements in order to seek an end, and then being able to, again, remain focused without bias while acknowledging your own bias in order to make the best and the most informed decision possible with the data you have at your disposal. So that's contextually relevant intelligence. Does that make sense, or is that too nerdy?
Yeah. No, sorry, Mark. Did you?
I think I speak for everybody when I say, "Huh?"
and I think that's the other side of the coin. So the conversation was very lively, but for me to package that for someone who's got to take that into a nonprofit or a commercial organization, commercial entity or other type organization, and say yes, all that. How do I black box all that stuff, bring it into my org, and make it relevant for my org, make it consumable, right fit? I remember recently in my role as a consultant for Optiv down at one of the Blues, and basically they had turned basically gave us the hand, gave Optiv the hand, said we're not buying anything from you. You know, you're talking about intelligence. It's not relevant. It doesn't understand our context. So going back to context, having the right contextual evidence for the things that really mattered for that particular blue. So what they did was they pulled all the blues together, formed a closed ecosystem where they brought data sets, data feeds that were relevant for their organizations, and came up with their own closed system. Were able to extract or extrapolate threats and intelligence from that particular closed ecosystem that made sense for their environment. And so for me, the challenge that, I kind of explained to Will is, when someone's trying to sell me something, how do I know that it makes sense for my environment? You're selling me something that says it'll provide me benefits, it will help me get behind the instance that I'm seeing, provide context, provide layers of semantic importance so that I might be able to, better protect my environment, and have always come up on the shorthand end of the stick in trying to make those things work. And then also helping others try to do the same, if that makes sense.
So I think what I'm trying to understand a little bit is the kind of the problem, right? I think there's a lot of different intelligence sources out there, right? In what it sounds like is, how do you understand what intelligence sources are valid for your business? Then how do you consume that? And then how do you analyze and really figure out what to do with that data? I mean, is that kind of the structure of the talk, is to help identify where are those sources? What are the things that would help me in the systems that would help me kind of analyze those in the Security Operations Center? I'm trying to figure out how all those pieces come together, right?
Yeah, Mark, do you want me to take that, or you want to?
You can start.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a portion of the talk. I think at the same time, it's really being able to, first and foremost, if I'm a CISO or I'm a board member or I'm some other C-level executive or a stakeholder, it's understanding first and foremost the business, understanding what comprises the business, what makes the business, fundamentally speaking, or the organization effective in whatever endeavor it's choosing to do, and then understand the risk paradigms that are associated with that business. And those risk paradigms extend to threat vulnerability, right? The traditional equations that we utilize within this space. But at the same time, they extend beyond bits and bytes. They extend to personnel. They extend to targets of interest. They extend to targets of opportunity that can be leveraged as pivot points to gain access or entry into targets of interest, right? And it's looking at and assessing the posture of the organization as well as the personnel within that organization to make the best determination of the data that we have at our disposal to properly shore up and reduce the attack surface related to that organization, to the assets of consideration or the critical assets, in addition to the personnel which we deem to be high value targets from an intelligence perspective.
So this is interesting. Could you guys give us an example? I know you guys can't name names for different organizations, but can you give us an example where you went into an organization, kind of implied this particular methodology, and then what was the state of that organization before, and what was the outcomes after these kind of approaches have been implemented?
Yeah, you want to go, Mark, or do you want to?
Sure. The typical organizations I've gone into have been those without any very low security spend, low maturity. If you're going in to do particular framework assessments, kind of have not given any thought or foresight to investment in security. So they've always been kind of trying to rapidly react to their state of awareness. Once we've gone in and done these typical assessments, and then being able to as Will kind of pointed out, find out, what's the threat model, what type of things are we seeing based on those limited investments, kind of understanding the business and understanding, what are the other interdependencies with which in the ecosystem within that business operates, and understanding how to extend the assessment further out into those other areas that business touches, and then kind of helping them understand, first and foremost, these are what we're enumerating as your first level of threats, and should you start paying more attention to these. And I know in one instance had already walked into a situation where the environment was badly compromised. To the point that we're facing a nation state without any proper tooling or solutioning on the ground or processes and people to kind of help do the proper intelligence gathering, and so trying to step someone through that is kind of one of the experiences that I'm trying to bring to bear on other organizations that I'm going into today.
So the organization was under attack by a nation state. You guys came in, and did you guys bring actual threat intelligence about that nation state attacker, indicators of compromise, the types of things that they would do, and they were able to successfully identify it? What did you guys do in that situation? Because that's interesting.
We first brought solutioning in, which is not normally my way of doing things, but we had nothing on the ground, so we brought some solutioning in. We saw some indicators on that solution, and kind of brought that to this immature organization. The organization basically kind of waved it off and said, "Well, we don't have any money right now. Let's think about what's happening." Maybe 6 months later, we go back into that organization. It's a full-blown incident now, and so at that point, we're depending on external teams to come in to help us bring to bear other assessment capabilities, whether to discovery, what have you, to find out the extent of the compromise. It wasn't until the other side of that remediation that we were able to say, these are the way the attacker had come into this particular organization had also come into other orgs at that time. And I think one of the things we want to touch upon in the talk is if I had known about the downstream attacks at other similar organizations, might that have helped us in that particular org to have a better lens prior to going into that environment?
I want to. Sorry, Mark. I want to turn it over to Jeff because he's been trying to ask a question for a while.
Sure. Well, and hopefully this will dovetail a little bit. I sort of have two questions for you. The first one is, and it's for either or both of you. I feel a little bit kindred to both of you because I used to be in the DOT on the one hand, and I used to be at TJX on the other hand. But I wanted just to have you just start by backing up, and rather than assuming that the entire audience knows what we mean by silly terms like threat and vulnerability and risk, if you could maybe do the formal DoD version and the translated version like you did earlier, of just taking a stab at defining the terminology that we're using here. Once you do that, then I have an application question taking those definitions. It's sort of a real world thing, and I'd like to get your take on it.
You want me to go first, or
I want you to go first. Yes.
I think that in terms of of threat and vulnerability, like vulnerability is a state or a condition of being associated with an asset, and that asset can be a person, it can be a system, it can be a building, it can be an environment that wherein exists a potential for exploitation. A threat can be an external or internal force that at some point in time segues, if they're internal, from being a trusted element that is not deemed suspicious or malicious into the suspicious and or malicious. Now, there are also conditions that apply wherein situations and access from to authorized systems by authorized parties that are outside of the circle of trust can be compromised, and that changes things slightly with respect to threat. External threats are a little different. We understand those concepts, whether they're criminals or whether they're agenda-driven entities or whether they're adversarial elements associated with a nation state or a proxy element that would be typical related to the context that one might see in a DoD type of scenario or in a Five Eyes type of scenario. I'll pause for a second. Are there any questions associated with those definitions or the use of those terms?
That was the good DoD version definition. So can we get the translated into lay language version from
Mark? You don't want me to do that?
If you can, I don't care who does it.
It's a very simple good. And Mark can correct me because he's got the power of the bow tie with him. So honestly, at the end of the day, a threat is any entity or any person or any actor that has some form of an agenda that's directed toward some environment or some asset or some person for explicit, suspicious, and or malicious means, wherein the potential for exploitation exists. Right, Mark? Would you like to take a stab at explain that maybe at an even lower level? Or?
I think that's clear for the everyday lay folks. When we're talking about vulnerabilities, areas of like you said that are exploitable, and again, I don't know if I can add any more to that, but that's kind of that's what exploitable by an internal or external or agent. That's I hate to use terms like that. There are gaps that that are harm that it can be harmed and exploited by folks that have as their agenda means to cause harm or to gain access or the like to the environments that you've been.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I'm really not trying.
But I also like I also like NIST definitions, and I like the ISO definitions too. I think the ISO definitions are really pretty good and easily digestible. Maybe a little more so than the traditional DoD ones as well.
The one thing you guys didn't really touch on, if you could tie it all together in a short or concise definition of risk, or let me put it to you this way: do you agree that whatever risk is in some way a function of threats and vulnerabilities, and what we do in terms of security?
Mark, would you like to go first, or do you want?
Sure, I agree with that. It's one of the challenges that I'm dealing with on a daily basis. We have these vulnerabilities. We're tying them to threats, and then trying to get beyond the enumeration of threats and vulns and say the combination of these things has a specific impact on our adverse impact on our business, and trying to get management buy-in to say, in the overall context of all the things that comprise risk in our organizations, are these security risk enough, or these impacts, or these adverse impacts on that overall business important enough in the overall risk of a company. And so when we're talking to the board, I've been guilty of this in the past of saying we have all these vulnerabilities and these are the threats, and you should pay attention, as opposed to talking about what's the impact on the business and the business ability to carry out its core objectives.
Okay,
think
so
very
here's
simple
my
for
question,
me,
and I've been pondering this for the last day, and I'm not sure I have an answer yet. I'm interested in your opinion. Real world situation. It was revealed earlier this week, and I think we'll talk about it during the news segment. But Strava apparently has these heat maps, and there's an article that came out that I put up on the notes. Strava heat map is a security risk, and it's in quotes. So my question is, if I think we read that statement and we all think, well, yeah, that makes sense. But if you accept that risk is a function of vulnerabilities and threats, and we were having this argument last night at a DC hacker meetup, shout out to CapSec DC. If the Strava heat map thing is a risk, what about it makes it a risk? Is it classified? Does it fall under the category of a threat, or does it fall under the category of a vulnerability, or is it something else?
I think personally, one of the things that I think it's important to note when you start talking about threats, vulnerabilities, and risks is really that we used to teach historically, and the ISC squared was big on this, and to a lesser extent ISACA was too, that model threat times vulnerability equals risk, which was borrowed from the actuarial community, was really the penultimate model. But one of the things I think is fundamentally important to reiterate is that exploitation, right, and opportunity are really what are the driving forces with respect to what influences a risk, right? So with Strava, there's nothing necessarily inherently wrong or risky about Strava if you're using that to run around your neighborhood or run around downtown Baltimore, well, maybe, or downtown Chicago, right? If you're running around a classified military installation, and you're porting that data to a cloud-driven ecosystem that's shareable, right, and it's made public to an extent, or greater or lesser than, therein lies the conundrum, right? Because native functionality is not necessarily risky. Context drives the ultimate level of risk associated with that particular capability of that particular application, right? There's nothing inherently wrong with a heat map, right? We might find that useful for any number of different use cases. In context, however, the risk, right, the threat posed by that particular capability and the ultimate condition of risk is extraordinary, or has the capability to be, or potential to be extraordinary.
So, okay, so I've got I don't want to necessarily push back on the Strava thing, but one of the things that does concern me is that was the risk that everyone was talking about, and it's absolutely true. So if you have somebody that's running around a specific classified military base and they run 15 miles a day, that might be someone that may be interesting to various nation state actors. And there was a whole bunch of people that came out and said, oh, this is a huge risk, this is a huge risk, this is a huge risk. I don't know, maybe. And the reason why I say I don't know, maybe, is it is absolutely interesting. But whenever we couple that with, for example, the Navy likes to post all of their promotions on something like Facebook, and they give the they give the rank of what that person became and what their role is. And in there, if you actually look at the roles and you know how to read that properly, you can actually read the roles of the people that just got promoted in the Navy, and you can say, oh, these people right here, they're actually Navy SEALs. And that's something that the United States government gives up all the time, that basically gives a full reckoning of all the people that may be in some level of special forces and promotions. And this is one of my concerns. We all get worked up over the Strava thing, and it's really, really, really cool whenever there may be something that's a lot easier where adversaries can get that particular bit of information as well, that tends to get ignored for a long, long, long time.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And I don't want to cut Mark off, but I think Strava is just is an interesting use case due to the prevalence and the known use cases and the known demonstrations of that data related to specific sites. But you're absolutely right. Social media, within the context of militaristic or intelligence-driven ecosystems or a whole plethora of other scenarios, is problematic in that by design and by default, so many different variables related to individuals, their geolocation, information related to their known associates, their preferred businesses, their places of work, et cetera, are given up freely, right? That's sort of the that's sort of the Faustian pact that, societally speaking, people have made in the last 10 to 15 years with social media, right? They want the convenience, they want the comfort, they want the easy accessibility. At the same time, they're willing to sign these, the Faustian pact, right? Everybody gets familiar with that concept of the deal with the devil, right? And they're making that concession. And in doing so, most people are blissfully ignorant of what that really means, too, and including people, like you just mentioned, who are utilizing, I'll just say, social media sites, social media networks. Is it okay to name names? I guess we did already, right? So Facebook, for example, right? They kind of post geolocation information that also happens to have rank and billet, et cetera, that could be utilized to identify targets. Mark, what do you think about that?
I was just thinking about the application in the business context. In terms of, I mean, you brought into this conversation the notion of exploitability and how that has impact on risk. Not meaning to jump away from the Strava conversation, but I know when we're making decisions in our vulnerability discussions currently in my current role, I noticed that there's no notion of risk score. I kind of started talking about CVSS, and you brought up context and manipulating that. How do I know this? Why are we spending much time?
Wait, sorry. Did you just say CVSS in context in the same sentence? Sorry.
I did.
That was
okay.
pretty awesome.
Actually.
We spend an enormous amount of time pouring resources into the wrong, trying to remediate the wrong risk because we've not done, this particular vulnerability may not be as exploitable as vulnerability, the next vulnerability, and so. I'm curious about these type of examples, like the Strava example, and actually how that plays out in everyday organizations, how they're trying to make decisions, around which risk should be rated higher. Is it just that threat, times vuln equals risk, or are these other layers that are necessary to make better judgments on where to spend resources and on what remediation we should focus upon? If that makes sense.
I think it does.
Yep, makes perfect sense.
I want to kind of go. I want to go in a slightly different direction with respects to intelligence, and a couple of people have kind of pointed this out in this light that when they get intelligence about other companies, maybe in their vertical, that are being hacked in some way, they don't find it very valuable because they read the report and they're like, "Oh yeah, you were hacked in this way," and I can go search my network for those types of indicators, and either I come up blank or I've already found those because they triggered something in my security architecture that I've already discovered them, and therefore intelligence from these external sources is really just stuff happening on other people's networks and not relevant to me. Do you folks agree with that at a certain level, or think there's a better way to use intelligence?
So if I understand, you're asking if we find it valuable to have information about our peers within an industry vertical, mm-hmm. and whether or not that is advantageous and helpful, engage in our own potential risk and exploitability. Did I understand that? Did I get that?
Correct.
Okay. I think it is, but I think at the same time, excuse me, I think it's valuable and I think it's important, but at the same time, every organization, whether they're in the same industry vertical or not, is unique. Every organization's structure is different. Every organization's executive leadership team is different. Every organization's board is different. Every organization's operational norms are different. Their geolocations are different. So it's important to understand what's occurring within an industry vertical. But at the same time, that's not that's not the be all end all. And I think that's maybe where you're going, right? You use that, I think, as a high watermark. This is what's occurring within a vertical. The DBIR guys, the Verizon report, the Verisk framework driven stuff is really good for that. High watermark with respect to various industry verticals. Here's what's occurring for the last year. What can we learn from them? I think it would be a mistake to use that as a sole source for driving operational security. in the context and in a framework that sees identification of vulnerabilities and the remediation of those vulnerabilities, whether they're technical or behavioral, exclusively. But I think it's a useful tool and capability. Mark, what do you think?
Well, does someone want to say something?
Yeah, it was John.
Oh, yeah. I just wanted to say
I knew he
I
would be
agree
chiming
with that.
in.
And I think that kind of the biggest reason why it bothers me whenever people start asking questions like, okay, so you just did an assessment for our particular organization. How does our organization rate with other organizations? Or the question is, what are other organizations doing? Is such a horrible question. And the reason why it's a horrible question is because whenever we're usually asked that question, it is usually based around, we want to know where the actual middle is. Like, we want to know when we've started investing too much into computer security or too little in computer security. And God knows we don't want to invest more or do more than what everyone else is doing. It's kind of that constant effort to find the middle of the herd as much as possible. It's not really saying what is actually being done that's good in my market vertical. If we start saying you got to use firewall segmentation between all of your endpoint hosts, well, a customer that comes back and is like, well, what are the other people in our market vertical doing? The reason why they ask that question is because they're trying to find a way out of getting to implement that particular control.
Ding, ding, ding.
And that is one of my main concerns about that question.
Why would I do it if no one
Well,
else
yeah,
does?
the heart of the question is, how little do I have to spend? And somehow due diligence and industry best practice translates to a dollar amount.
And I also like to tell a lot of my customers, you don't want to do what everyone else is doing. Trust me, their security is horrible. We can do better. I mean, that's what we got to do. People have got to try to do better than what that minimum is.
But I think when we look at the intelligence sources out there today, and a lot of these reports like the DBIR that are very focused on attacks, maybe not all of those are successful attacks, but it's data about attacks. What about data and reports about what's working? And that's really what people are after. And I get that. I don't like it either when organizations are like, well, I just want to do what other people are doing that are successful. But if we can highlight the data the same way we highlight the attacks, but highlight the defenses that way, I think we'd have much better success.
We used to do that. 10 years ago or more, maybe closer to 15 now, we used to talk readily and often about best practices. Somewhere along the line, the conversation changed, and there was a shift, and I'm not really sure what led to that.
Yeah, but that conversation 15 plus years ago about best practices was garbage. It was a bunch of people coming up with a series of ideas on how computer security looked with very little understanding of how actual attacks looked. So the reason why so many people started getting away from best practices on hardening Windows 2000 or how you should set up your firewall and all this stuff is because there wasn't value in it. It wasn't working. It wasn't directly applicable to what was stopping attacks. And I think one of the clearest examples for me on this was DISA. They released this gold disk, like the gold image for a Windows system, and that's a hardened Windows computer system. And anybody that is associated with DISA needs to use that image. And years ago, Richard Bajlik had a class at Black Hat, and that was his default Windows image that they used to demonstrate attacks against. So basically showing that a lot of those controls that were in place that were best practices didn't provide very much value at all. And that's also one of the reasons why we came up with critical security controls, is we wanted to develop best practices that were actually tied to real attacks and actually stopping real attacks as much as possible.
I would say that, again, and not to argue with you too much, but I think that best practices, again, are not ubiquitous or universal either. So I think it depends on the context, and it depends on the population group that you're a part of when you talk about that. When I was involved in the consulting space, when we talked about best practices, it was very much driven from sizable portions of population groups that came out of government that were actively working in assessment capabilities, penetration, red teaming before it was fashionable, and leveraging that data for our client base. So you're not wrong. I think that high-level generic best practices are, it's very much a your mileage may vary situation, especially then. But again, it wasn't exclusively driven by that, right? But that was also a determining factor in seeing a higher price paid for access to that data and that experience, right? So I don't think there's anything wrong with talking about best practices, which is I think what Paul's alluding to. You just have to be wise with respect to what practices you're talking about and the data that drives those practices.
The reason I don't like best practices is because they often don't define what the desired outcome should be.
Yep.
And I think that's where people lose sight. Like, the best practice is to harden a Windows system this way. Well, that's great, but what's the desired outcome to being able to do that?
Well, and then we violate the best practice by throwing root-based agents on the box and completely subverting the best practice in the first place, right? So, I mean, we were part of our own problem, right?
Well, we use the word best instead of just calling them practices.
Right.
No, but that's the root. Like that's the root. No pun intended of our problem. We wanted to say it's the best practice instead of realizing these are the practices we're using, and then we didn't define them. So then I'd say, well, I didn't really like Paul's way of doing it, so I'll do it this way, and I'll call it a best practice. What the hell?
Yeah. Mark, you were going to say something. I think we got ahead of you. I apologize.
No. I think the conversation is kind of veered off from where I was going. But you mentioned not. I think it was John mentioned. Don't depend on what's happening in someone else's environment. If I heard you correctly, I wonder about the ISAC. So in that one situation that I referenced earlier, we knew that 4 other entities had been attacked in the same way. Is that type of knowledge? Maybe I shouldn't call it intelligence, but is that type of intelligence or knowledge important? If I had a pre-attack to put some proper controls in place, and now I'm thinking about the ISACs where you have to pay to play.
Yeah, but Mark, are you assuming then that because you're in the ISAC that you have context? Right, because the thing I always find fascinating about intelligence is that a lot of times it's just information. Information without context, and timing. But I think, am I reading into it too much? Like if I'm part of an ISAC that I paid money for, these are people who are at some level like me. So, but then are we actually providing context and actionable insights, or are we pretending we are, and this is going to be our best practices conversation in 10 to 15 years?
You hit on 2 good points. Information that's non-synthesized and non-tested is not intelligence. But I would say, Mark, I'll let you answer the ISAC question because I'm not a part of one. But you hit on a very important point with respect to intelligence as a whole. Information is just information until it's qualified, tested, vetted, synthesized, right, and challenged.
Yeah, but by that time, with threat intelligence, a lot of the threat intelligence feeds that are out there, by the time you go through and quantify and do all of those things, it's too late because the attackers have moved on to different tactics.
Yep.
That's fair.
And even the ISACs from look, FSISAC is probably the best example of,
it's the best.
Of the
it's
ISAC.
The best example.
All the other ones have failed pretty miserably in the space.
So why do we keep duping people to pay their money to have access to the intelligence? The market has been kind of formed in such a way that you have to spend to get quote unquote the gold intelligence versus the bronze intelligence. I mean, it's one of the talking points we want to get at in the conversation at InfoSecWorld is, are we duping end users or consumers of quote unquote this marketed intelligence? And
no, see, I don't think we're duping them. I think it's that we don't step back and consider the problem. We just go, oh, I know their problem. They didn't do it this way. And so we slap a new best practice on top of it, and we keep doing it. I think the people involved, intentions are good. I think it's a noble effort. I think it's that we don't step back and say, how did other industries go through their maturation cycle to get to the point where they could have something that they could call at least a good practice or a standard practice. We're kind of really good at doing the exact same thing again and again and again, maybe calling it a slightly different word, but proclaiming that because we're the ones doing it this time, not the other people who were just like us, it'll work, trust me. But I don't think it's born out of maliciousness. I don't think we're duping anybody. I think we're duping ourselves, maybe.
I think this is getting dangerously close to that vehemently despised conversation in security about the fail mentality. So if we can avoid talking about why we're failing as an industry, that would be great. I think you're right. We fall prey to our own cognitive bias, right? When it comes to especially closed groups, best practices, or especially with respect to intelligence, is always driven by a couple of things, right? Freshness, accuracy, verifiability of sources, and relevance of those sources as it relates to broad spectrum applicable population groups, right? And the vetting of that intelligence is really key, right? So I don't think the ISACs have done anything wrong. And you brought up a really good point. There are many, or there were many. The FSISAC stands head and shoulders above the rest. But I don't know that it's a bad thing to encourage the practice and to continue the propagation, and the continued existence of those ISACs for other industries, like the retail ISAC, I think is a great thing. specifically driven by the fact that there have been so many breaches and compromises of large, broadly deployed retail environments that have affected so many millions of people.
Well,
So
I just want
to
hold on. Well, I'm sorry. This will be quick, Jeff. And that's all you. I don't think that we're failing as an industry. I think that's a myth we got to stop too. I see no objective signs of it. You look at global shrinkage; it's the lowest it's been in 40 years. You look at the total volume of cybercrime relative to total transactions; it's lower than global shrinkage. Like, I see no objective evidence that we're doing anything but succeeding, except for our own headlines. Like, we like to beat ourselves up over it, but I think if you're watching this, you're kicking ass and taking names, and I love you for it.
I do want to say, one of the concerns I have, kind of sticking on the threat intelligence type idea, and everybody knows on the show that I don't hide my disdain for threat intelligence very well at all. But here's a question:
It's only a
if you're
threat
an
to your
organization
intelligence,
that's
it's
going
not-
to be spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on threat intelligence, I find it odd that many organizations are willing to spend a tremendous amount of money to try to figure out what bad guys are doing, but they're not willing to invest that much money to try to truly understand what is going on the inside of their own network. And if we get into a core problem, if you do not know what's happening in your network, you do not understand your processes, you do not understand your systems, the APIs, how all of these things interrelate with each other, then it doesn't matter how much money you're going to spend on a threat intelligence feed, you are going to fail. And I know we just got done talking about failure, and we can kind of pat each other on the back in the security industry, but if you don't know your own network, you're going to get compromised hard, and more importantly, you're not going to react to it very well.
No, John, I'd say that's failure. I'm with you on that. I just mean industry-wide, we're okay.
I would agree with you. I spent a sizable portion of my my career in various capacities of offense and defense. Visibility and forensic capability and forensic knowledge of enterprise environments has been core to what I've done for more years than I care to think about sometimes. I find it fascinating that people are so dismissive of the value of that capability, broad spectrum contextual awareness, enterprise networks and ecosystems down to the endpoint. And you're absolutely right. Without having a clear understanding and a deep visibility in your environment, down to the application layer, down to the down to the API, to your point, we do ourselves a disservice, right? And no threat intelligence feed on the planet is going to save you if you don't know yourself first, right? Some are better than others. Some services are head and shoulders remarkably better than others. But in the end, if you don't know your own environment, it's like knowing your body. you have, in some degree, if you don't listen to the pain points in your own body, the likelihood of you experiencing some cataclysmic event is pretty significant, right? And it's the same with an enterprise ecosystem, right? You have to know yourself.
Will and Mark, speaking of knowing yourself, are you ready to play 5 questions with Security Weekly? Sorry, Jeff, we're out of time. We're actually over time. So you guys ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
The answer is yes, you're ready.
Yes, you are ready.
The answer is also no, you're never ready.
Don't worry, it's a best practice. You're going to ace it.
I'm going to start with Will. Will's going to answer the first question, and then I'm going to go to Mark. He's going to answer the first question, and then Mark's going to answer the second question, and then you'll be fine. You'll figure it out. So
it's easy.
Will, 3 words to describe yourself.
3 words to describe myself. Passionate, balding, and a family man.
Mark, 3 words to describe yourself.
Family, connector, and enthusiast.
Mark, if you were a serial killer, what would be your weapon of choice?
In my head, my mind, I'm thinking laser, some type of laser, something to that effect.
Ooh. Will, what would be your weapon of choice if you were a serial killer?
Being that I'm from Chicago and it's the middle of winter, an icicle, of course.
Will, if you wrote a book about yourself, what would the title be?
Whiskey and Bad Decisions, Life and Times of a Man on a Mission.
Mark?
Lethal Weapon.
Mark, in the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
Repeat the question, please.
In the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby, do you prefer to go first or second?
I want to get in there first.
Will, first or second in the popular game of Ask Grabby Grabby?
I'm not familiar with this game. Is this unique to Rhode Island?
It is popular in Europe. It's where it originated.
Yeah. I guess I'd want to be first, you know.
And after my own heart.
Will, choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
2 celebrities to be my parents. Wow. I would say Nikola Tesla and Gina Lollobrigida.
Oh.
Mark, choose 2 celebrities to be your parents.
Alive, dead, fictional, or otherwise.
Puff Daddy and Selma Hayek.
Oh.
He was like he was ready with
Yeah,
that.
he was ready
Wow.
with that one.
Damn.
He rehearsed that one.
Mark and Will, thank you very much for appearing on Paul's Security Weekly this evening. Make sure you check out their talk at the upcoming InfoSecWorld conference happening in Orlando, Florida, March 19th through the 21st. With that, we'll take a short break. Come back with the MITRE ATT&CK framework and Caldera. Stay tuned.